Okay, welcome everyone to Bologna virtually EARIE 2020, the invited session number 6. On price discrimination, we're very pleased to have Renato Gomes today talking about brand loyalty. He's from the Toulouse School of Economics, and he'll be followed by Laura Doval, who's at Columbia Business School, and she will be talking about nonlinear pricing. Both speakers are happy to take questions along the way if questions pop up, and they'll take a little break after they presented the model. Renato, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. So is everybody seeing my screen? Yes? Okay. So I'll talk about, I first have to apologize for changing the title of the paper. The paper is the same, but just the title changed. Now it's called Nonlinear Pricing in Oligopoly, How Brand Preferences Shape Market Outcomes. This joint work with Jean-Marie Lozachmeur, who is a colleague in Toulouse, and Lucas Maestri, who is at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. So as Simon already mentioned, the topic is price discrimination, more specifically second-degree price discrimination. So if you ask Wikipedia for a definition, it's going to tell you that it's the design and pricing of a product line when consumers self-select according to unobserved preference characteristics, right? So this kind of price discrimination, or nonlinear pricing, I'm going to use both terms interchangeably, it has obsessed economists for a long time, right? So perhaps the first one to talk about it at length was Jules Dupuy, who was an economist engineer in France, and he wrote about nonlinear pricing in the 1840s, and he was the first to point out that if you want to maximize profits, then the best way to do so is to design a product line in a way that you introduce downward distortions in quality everywhere except at the top. And this insight has been formalized by papers that we all know and love, like Moose and Rosen and Maestri and Riley. And the intuition should be familiar. The idea is that high valuation consumers, they would like to mimic low valuation consumers. And in order to make it less attractive, the monopolist distorts quality all over the product line, and therefore prevents profit dissipation and makes sure it can charge high prices at the top of the product line where profits are concentrated. So more specifically, you are interested in this paper in nonlinear pricing in an oligopolistic setting, right? And this clarity of insight is missing when one moves from competition, from monopoly to competition, and especially in settings where market power stems from consumers' brand preferences. So a critical feature of these markets is that consumers' preferences over product characteristics, they are often correlated with brand loyalty of consumers, of the propensity of these consumers to switch brands. And this possibility plays a key role in the empirical literature that estimates demand, a la Barry Levinson and Pakes or Nevo. So let me tell you a little bit about something that I know that I know very little about, which is demand estimation with random coefficients. So if you want to estimate demand with random coefficients, you adopt a discrete choice approach that posits that if a consumer I wants to buy a good, the good K from firm J, then this guy obtains a utility that's linear in price, linear in quality. Quality, I refer to quality as a product attribute that can be vertically ranked, right? And there is some brand taste that describes how much consumer likes one brand vis-a-vis the other. The issue is that when you try to estimate such a model, in most papers, not all, but in most papers, you don't observe individual level information. You only observe market outcomes, right? You observe a cross-section of markets, right? So in order to get more flexible estimates, Barry Levinson and Pakes introduced this random coefficients approach, which posits that the price sensitivity and the taste for quality, they are themselves random, they vary across consumers, and they are described by these auxiliary regressions that I put on the right-hand side. So price, for instance, is a constant plus a function of demographics plus a random shock. And these demographics, they are typically income, size of the household, some description about what kind of, where the guy lives, and so on and so forth. And this literature constantly found that quality and taste for quality and price sensitivities, they are correlated through demographics. So that means that different consumer segments, that is people that buy the low quality alternative or the high quality alternative, they systematically differ on their propensity to switch brands, for instance, due to price discounts. So if you discount the price, different consumer segments react very differently to it. And so this correlation can go either way. It depends on the market. There's no, across markets, there's no reason to expect that high taste consumers will be more or less brand loyal. So just to illustrate, to make things more palpable, let's suppose that income is the main factor behind one's preferences, right? So one should expect that high earners, they like premium products, right? The guy's gonna buy the best possible TV. But at the same time, high earners have a lower marginal utility of money, so they are less likely to react to price discounts, okay? So if you think that income is the main driver behind one's preferences, then consumers with stronger taste for quality, they should be less likely to switch brands, okay? So in the paper, we discuss lots of empirical contributions that find this pattern, but for the sake of this talk, let's just think of Air France. So I really have a low opinion of Air France. So Air France is a company that they make a lot of money on business travelers that have a high willingness to pay for quality. They like the lounge, they like comfort, they like the business class and so on. But they are not propense at all to switch brands and to move to a low-cost airline, basically because they have these fantastic mileage programs that are very convex. And also because in most cases, they are not even paying the ticket, right? So these guys, they share high taste for quality and a lot of brand loyalty. Whereas people that have lower taste for quality or for comfort, think of tourists that don't take a flight that often, once or twice a year, they have lower taste for quality and they are much more likely to switch to EasyJet or to a low-cost alternative if price discounts are sufficiently attractive. So airline markets is a market that I believe share exactly this correlation, right? The income story, basically. But this is not always the case. For instance, Gregory Crawford and co-authors in a recent paper at the EARIE, they study the cable TV market, and they find that consumers with stronger tastes for the quality of the channel package, that means packages that have a large number of channels, that's the measure of quality. They are easier to poach through price discounts. Okay? And they also incidentally find that quality is over-provided at the top of the product line. Okay? So in this paper, we take the conclusions from the applied literature as well as the scheduled observations at heart, and basically all of that suggests that this correlation is not only empirically relevant, you can actually find in the literature, but it's also consequential for pricing and for product design. But theory is mostly silent about this important issue. So the goal of this paper is to study precisely how this correlation affects pricing and product design. There is a long related literature that studies oligopolistic nonlinear pricing. The seminal contributions are Armstrong, Vickers, and Loertscher and Stoll, but they mostly focus on the case where brand substitutability or brand loyalty is independent of taste for quality. Okay? And we're basically more interested in the other scenarios. Right? Ellison, in a contribution in 2005, argues that brand substitutability is lower for high types. So that's the income story that I just told. But Ellison assumes that qualities are exogenous, which is, by contrast, we endogenize quality provision, we endogenize the design of the product line, and that's at the core of our contribution. There are other papers as well that touch on the topics that we develop in our paper, but for the sake of brevity, I might come back to them on demand. but I would like to describe the model if I may. So the model is a plain vanilla Moose and Rosen kind of model, right? So you have a unit mass continuum of consumers. They have single unit demands and quasi-linear utilities. Okay? So consumers, they are heterogeneous on 2 dimensions. So theta is the valuation for quality, which in the baseline model can only assume 2 values, low or high. I'll talk about the continuum type specification at the end. In the paper, we have a long treatment of that. And the probabilities are PL and PH, obviously. Consumers, they are also endowed with a brand taste, which is denoted by X, and it lies somewhere in the unit segment. It's a Hotelling specification, okay? And these 2 draws, they are independent. And they are also private information, okay? So because firms cannot screen the brand taste of a consumer, I'm gonna abuse terminology and talk about theta as the consumer's type, okay? So please let me abuse terminology. So this is the consumer, these are the consumers. Let me tell you about the firms. So there are 2 firms. They are located at the 2 ends of the Hotelling line, and they compete by simultaneously posting a menu of price quality options. Okay, so they basically the set of actions is to choose a menu that contains price and quality pairs and ruling out stochastic mechanisms or reciprocal mechanisms or alike. And so the quality of the good K provided by firm J is QJK, and YJK is the price. Okay? So it's more costly for firms to provide high quality, as obvious, and that's described by a cost function that's convex and so on. Okay? So we're just like in a Moose and Rosen framework. So by choice of labels, I'm choosing labels, I'm describing contracts by what the consumer types prefer, right? So to rationalize my choice of labels, we have to impose incentive constraints. So this incentive constraint here, ICK, says that consumers of type K prefer the contract that are indexed by K to the contract that applies to type K hat, let's say, okay? And this quantity here is the gross utility that consumer of type K obtains from the contract of firm J, okay? So how consumers allocate themselves across firms? Just follows a Hotelling specification. So consumers compare the gross utilities from both firms, and they discount their brand tastes for one firm vis-a-vis the other. So the correlation that I was mentioning is captured by the fact that this parameter TK, which we call the brand loyalty of type K, it varies by type. So it might be that high type consumers, they have a very high TK, so they are very brand loyal. So you need to give a huge price discount to poach these people. Or the opposite might apply. High types might have a much lower brand loyalty parameter, in which case they see firms much more as homogeneous and they are easier to poach. Okay? So basically by tracking how TL and TH compare, we allow for different consumer types to have different brand loyalty. Okay? So in order to close the model, the only thing that's missing is how consumers compare the option provided by one firm to the outside option. And in that respect, we're going to follow Benabou and Tirole, who posit that consumers' brand tastes, they do not affect the comparison between one's preferred brand and the outside option. And to be specific, what it means that when consumers compare the contract offered by firm A to the outside option, they are basically comparing the net utility that they obtain from firm A, right, to the most profitable outside good. And the idea is that there are as many outside goods as firms, and these outside goods, they should be thought of as a generic substitute to each firm's product line. So therefore, they inherit the brand taste parameter. Okay? So this specification is interesting because basically because variations in TK do not change the relative value of firm A's alternative vis-a-vis the outside option, provided that guy prefers firms A to B. Okay? And this is of utmost importance when we deal with models of vertical differentiation. So that's how we model the comparison between one's contract and the outside option. And as we're going to see, this has very desirable properties in this setup with vertical differentiation. So without loss of generality, we can then assume that menu satisfies IC constraints, that's just product labels, and the IR constraints, gross utilities have to be weakly positive. And we're going to look for equilibria. That's basically a profile of pure or mixed strategies. So we allow firms to randomize over menus that are mutual best responses. Okay, so that's pretty much the model. So I'm happy to stop to answer questions if there are.
Thanks. Yeah, there's been one question in the Q&A, which is, should I think of the points program something endogenous as a brand preference?
Should I think of what, sorry?
Should I think of the points program? I think that relates to the Air France question as something endogenous. Should I think of that as a brand preference?
I'm telling you, yeah, absolutely. If you think too carefully about airline markets, these loyalty programs, they are very convex precisely because people want to increase brand loyalty for high users, right? So there is endogeneity on that, and it would be ideal to add a first step where in fact this instrument of brand loyalty is endogenized. I perfectly agree. I'm just taking as an example of if you just think that if your employer is paying the ticket, you're less price sensitive, and at the same time you like comfort, then you get the same start flying, you know. But I agree that specifically in airline markets, it would be interesting to endogenize this instrument. So brand loyalty might be endogenous, and that's a great example of where it is endogenous, right? But we're taking that as exogenous in our model. Okay, so if that's all, I move to preliminaries. Okay, as in Armstrong Vickers and elsewhere in the literature, it's much more convenient to work in the space of indirect utilities as opposed to the space of price and qualities, right? Indirect utilities this space is much more amenable to analysis. And in order to move to the space of indirect utilities, it's good to ask yourself the following question. Suppose that a firm is in equilibrium offering a menu that provides a profile of indirect utilities UL and UH. Okay? So you ask yourself the question, well, what's the profit maximizing way of delivering this profile of utilities? Okay? And the answer is simple. It only depends on the difference between UH and UL, between the gross utility to high types and to low types. If these utilities are very close to each other, then the profit maximizing way of offering this profile of utilities has the incentive constraint for high types binding. So high types would like to imitate low, and the firm has to underprovide quality at the bottom of the product line. If this difference in indirect utilities is intermediary, no incentive constraint binds, and you have efficiency everywhere. If this difference in indirect utilities is very high, the IC of low types binds, so low types would like to imitate high types, and you get over provision at the top of the product line. Okay? So we're going to basically use this lemma, let's say, and from now on focus on indirect utilities. So just for the sake of notation, QE, this superscript E denotes the efficient quality, and the same for surplus. SE is the surplus, the efficient surplus of K types. Okay? So having done this transformation, we can identify a menu with an indirect utility profile. So a menu becomes an indirect utility profile. The social surplus can be written directly in terms of this indirect utility profile. That's the gross utility minus the cost. And the profit per sale is just the social surplus of the K-type contract minus the utility that's given to K-types. Okay, so that's the way to write everything in terms of indirect utilities. So just as a refresher, we can rederive the monopolistic allocation or the Mussen-Rosen menu in this world of indirect utilities. We know that the IR of low types binds in Mussen-Rosen, and we know that the IC of high types also binds. So we can write the firm's problem of choosing an indirect utility UH to maximize profits for low types. Notice that the IR binds, so UL is 0, plus the profits from high types. There is efficiency at the top, so minus UH here. And when you take the first order condition, you obtain this expression which encapsulates the rent extraction and efficiency trade-off that's so familiar to all of us. So you don't need to pay attention to the math, just keep in mind, because this expression is going to appear over and over. Okay, good. So what's the road ahead? So the goal of the paper is to fill this graph. So here there is a graph where I have TL in the x-axis, I have TH in the y-axis, and I want to fill up this graph, okay? So in order to give intuition on what's going to happen, I'm going to start at the 45-degree line, which posits that brand preferences are the same for both types of consumers. Then I'm going to move to the bottom of barrel duopoly, which is an extreme case where high types see firms as perfectly competitive, but low types, they have varying degrees of brand loyalty. Okay? And I call it bottom of barrel because firms can only make profits on low types, which have a lower profit potential to start with. And then I move to this extreme case here, which is the opposite, right? The other side of the coin, where low types, they see firms as homogeneous, but high types are heterogeneous on their brand loyalty. And that's the cream skim duopoly because there's lots of profits to be obtained from those types with higher profit potential, which are the high types. Okay? And then I complete the square. So that's the goal here. So let me just describe first the balanced duopoly case. So I'm always describing equilibria by putting a star superscript, right? UL, UH star is the equilibrium outcome, okay? So don't look too much at the math. Let me give you a graph for what's going on. So we're moving along the 45-degree line, right? So if T is 0, we're in Bertrand. So it's Bertrand competition. Consumers, they appropriate the full efficient surplus of their contracts, okay? So if T is close to 0 along the diagonal, then we're going to obtain the complete information outcome. So no IC is going to bind, no IR is going to bind, and consumers are going to obtain a payoff that's just the very same payoff that they obtain in a complete information HOTLing setup. As T becomes larger, the IR of low types starts to bind, but the IC of high types is still slack. So low types, they get full rent extracted, but a quality provision is still efficient. When T is high enough, the IC of high types starts to bind, and then not only low types endure full rent extraction, but the quality is also distorted downwards because ICs are binding. And in this case, the equilibrium utility of high types is given by this equation here, right? So as T grows large, as the brand loyalty of both consumers grows large, you can notice that this first term vanishes. And the second term is the only thing that remains. And this second term, you might recall, is precisely the Musan-Rosen of optimality condition. Okay? So this version of HOTLing, which is due to Benabou-Hall, has the interesting property that as the brand loyalty of consumers grows large, you converge to the monopolistic outcome. Okay? Notice that the standard HOTLing approach, which basically puts the outside option at 0, does not have this property because as T grows large, the market basically breaks down because all consumers, or most consumers, right, they buy the outside option. Okay, so the number of consumers that go to the outside option converges to 1, right? Whereas in this specification of HOTLing, because we are holding constant the attractiveness of the outside option vis-a-vis each firm, we obtain convergence to monopoly. Okay, so I'm not bragging too much about this property. I'm just saying that this specification of demand makes sense because it delivers convergence to monopoly.
So Renato, does it also affect the behavior when T is very small?
No,
I don't see the analog. So what's the analog to that in the HOTLing setting? There you wouldn't you have the IR constraint binding then?
Yeah, no, that's the point. When T is small, the IR constraint would not be binding on the HOTLing. So the two models coincide. So in this area here, for instance, we reobtain the cost plus fee pricing that Armstrong Vickers and Roche Stoll obtained, which says that when the HOTLing line is sufficiently narrow, competition leads to efficiency and cost plus fee pricing. So for low values of brand loyalty, we agree with the literature, but for high values, things are different and we converge to monopoly.
Okay.
So having talked about the balanced duopoly case, let me just move to the bottom of barrel, which is the x-axis. Okay. We make a weak assumption that basically you can think of it as meaning that types are sufficiently close so that incentive compatibility constraints matter. Okay? If this assumption that's in the slide is not satisfied, then ICs don't matter and the analysis is trivial. Okay? So under this assumption, where ICs matter, we obtain the following. So in this figure here, I'm varying TL. TH is already at 0. I'm varying TL. So if TL is 0, we are at Bertrand. Okay? No big deal. If TL is small, IR constraints do not bind. We get efficient quality provision just under complete information. Okay? Self-selection doesn't matter. And the equilibrium is in pure strategies, of course. If TL is very high, we obtain a pure strategy equilibrium, where, not surprisingly, low types are fully extracted, right? Because TL is very high, they're very brand loyal. So low types are fully extracted, and high types, they obtain rents because there's perfect competition for them. But interestingly, the rents that they obtain are derived from a zero profit condition because of perfect competition. So this value UH ball is precisely described by this equation. That's a zero profit condition, right? So the surplus generated by the high type contract is fully appropriated by high types. Okay? The interesting aspect is that there is over provision at the top. Okay? So high types, they appropriate the full surplus, but it's not the efficient surplus. It's less than the efficient surplus because of over provision. And most interesting, perhaps, in the middle, there is no pure strategy equilibria. So necessarily, we have mixed strategy equilibria, which we characterize. But before getting there, let me tell you about why we don't obtain a pure strategy equilibria in this era. It might be that this threshold here is infinity. So it might be that we always have mixed strategy equilibria, but that depends on parameters. So why there's no such a pure strategy equilibria for intermediate values of TL? The reason is the following. Well, high types are perfectly competitive, right? So there is a zero profit condition applying to them. So they have to appropriate the surplus of their contract, whatever that surplus is. If it's efficient, it's the efficient surplus. If it's not efficient, it's less than the efficient. But they have to appropriate the full thing. So their indirect utility is given by this equation, which is saying that they appropriate the surplus, whatever it is. Bon, but firms are obtaining zero profit on high types. So one thing that they can always do is to forget about high types and just compete in the low type market, because the high type market is bringing nothing to them. So it turns out that in the low type market, they have to best respond as if low types were the only type around, because that's the only type where profits can come from. So the putative equilibrium, this is a necessary condition for equilibrium, is that firms obtain the complete information hotling outcome. So that's the putative equilibrium that we have to work with. And it turns out that there's always a profitable deviation for this putative equilibrium. And the idea is the following. Suppose that firms give an epsilon to high types. High types are perfectly competitive. So this epsilon is sufficient to corner the market, to take all the high type market to the house. And then firms, what they can do is that they can then increase the utility given to low types so as to relax the incentive constraint, which is low imitates high, and absorb all the efficiency gains that this deviation generated. So it turns out that if this program here, don't look at the math, but this program is formalizing this deviation. And this problem is quasi-concave, and if you take first order conditions, you see that this deviation is always locally profitable. It always defeats the putative equilibrium. And at the heart of this result is the following idea. When you give epsilon to high types, you corner their market, and you change the low type utility to raise the efficiency of the high type contract and appropriate this efficiency gain. When you do that, you are engaging in a first order gain among high types because you have a discrete jump on demand, but you are suffering a second order loss in the low type market because the equilibrium indirect utility was given by a first order condition. So marginal changes have a second order loss. So it's the race is always in favor of the deviation because of the first order gain. So when TL is sufficiently high, the IR of low type starts to bind. So in the low type market, this deviation is now, when you have to increase the indirect utility of low types, you are no longer in a local optimum. So because you are at the corner, because there is an IR constraint binding. So in fact, the race is between a first order gain, which is in the high types, you corner the market and you appropriate efficiency gains, and the first order loss in the low type market because you have a binding constraint. Okay? So in this case, the putative equilibrium, which is now, it has to deliver zero utility to low types, right? Because TL is sufficiently high. This putative equilibrium can in fact defeat the deviation. And it depends on the magnitude of the business stealing effects among low types. So that's why we have a threshold structure. So basically, these are the reasons for why you have failure of pure strategy equilibrium in the intermediate region, or basically for all parameters to the right. So equilibrium is necessarily mixed strategies, and we can in fact characterize this equilibrium. And as it happens in other instances, the ideas behind the mixed strategy equilibria have a lot to do with the deviation that I just described, right? With the deviation that defeats the candidate pure strategy equilibrium. And indeed, in the mixed strategy equilibria, the IC of low types will always bind in all equilibrium menus, and all equilibrium menus will involve over-provision at the top. So firms will differentiate themselves in the equilibrium support according to how big is the discount that they give to low types. And this discount that they give to low types enables these firms to provide more efficient quality at the top because it relaxes the incentive constraint. Okay? And at the same time, because it increases the efficiency of the high type contract, firms then have more incentive to increase indirect utilities of high types. So the equilibrium is also ordered in that indirect utilities co-move across menus. So if a menu gives more indirect utility to low types, it has to give more indirect utilities to high types as well. So in the paper, we have a complete description of this mixed strategy. I just wanted to give the highlights. The highlights is the ordered structure of equilibrium and the fact that menus that give more indirect utilities are more generous. And the logic behind the equilibrium is very much similar to the relaxing undercut deviation that I described. So this is my brief description of the bottom of the arrow case. Now I go to the y-axis, okay? I'm not going to spend too much time on the cream skimming case, where low types are perfectly competitive and high types, they have varying degrees of brand loyalty. Basically because it's a mirror image of what I just described. So if you move along the y-axis, when TH is small, you have an efficient pure strategy equilibrium. You don't have a pure strategy equilibrium for intermediate values, and you might have a pure strategy equilibrium back for high values of TH. Okay, so and similarly to what happens in the bottom barrel, it's just a mirror image. Low types, now you have downward distortions at the bottom, right? So low types, they are fully extracted, and their quality is distorted downwards, extremely so. So they are not served basically. So low types are not served, high types are fully extracted. And that's the equilibrium in pure strategy when it exists. Okay? So now I'm going to complete the picture. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the remaining cases. So just to recall, I described to you the 45-degree line, I described to you the x-axis, and I described to you the y-axis. Okay, now I have to complete the picture. Completing the picture entails describing what happens for all values of TL and TH, which are not zero and are not identical, right? So it turns out that we have three regions. We have the region E, which is the efficient region, that's in the vicinity of the 45-degree line. Okay? We have the region D+, which is close to the x-axis, to the bottom barrel case, and we have the region D-, that's close to the cream skimming case that I described. It's this region here. So the next proposition is describing how distortions vary across regions. Okay? So in region E, quality provision is always efficient to both types of consumers, and the equilibrium is in pure strategies, just like under complete information. Okay? So this region E is basically saying that, look, you get efficient quality provision in the balanced duopoly case. This is still true if you're close to a 45-degree line. Okay? And there is this horizontal band here. This horizontal band is there because you can increase TL and you don't change equilibrium outcomes because the IR flow type is already binding. So it doesn't okay. So in region D+, for instance, all equilibrium menus exhibit over-provision of quality to high-type consumers. So we might be in a pure strategy equilibrium or in a mixed strategy equilibrium. Doesn't matter. All equilibria exhibit over-provision at the top. And that's in region D plus here. And the intuition should be familiar, right? If you fix TH for TL sufficiently high, the IC constraint of low types has to bind. So low types will be willing to mimic high types in equilibrium. And that makes firms over-provide quality at the top, be it pure or mixed strategies. It applies to both. And in region D minus is the opposite that's occurring. So if you fix TL for TH sufficiently high, you're going to be in the region where firms under-provide quality at the bottom. And that's because high types will be sufficiently more brand loyal than low types. And then they will be willing to mimic the low type contract. And therefore, you have to under-provide quality at the bottom. So these are the distortions. A second interesting feature of equilibria in the general case has to do with informational rents. So we're typically used to thinking that informational rents, they typically, that informational rents, they are typically positive, right? But under competition, it so occurs that informational rents are always weakly positive for one type of consumer and weakly negative for the other. And that's what occurs here. In region E, you have the complete information outcome. So, the information rents are zero, right? You just get what you get under complete information. In region D plus, relative to complete information, high types lose, whereas low types gain from asymmetric information. And in region D minus is the opposite that occurs. Relative to complete information, high types gain, and low types lose from asymmetric information. Simon, just to check, how much time do I have?
Like 5 more minutes or so.
5 more minutes.
Yeah.
So the reason for why informational rents may be negative is easy to understand if we think about region D plus. Okay, so think about region D plus where we have over provision at the top, and let's think of a pure strategy equilibrium where low types get zero rents. This is all characterized in the paper. I'm just getting a simple example to give you the intuition. So at the equilibrium, if a firm wants to increase the high type utility, it's gonna balance 3 effects. The first effect is familiar, is the poaching gain, right? If you increase the indirect utility, you're gonna get more consumers. That's proportional to the brand loyalty, and you get and your gains proportional to the profits that you're obtaining in equilibrium. So that's the marginal gain, which we call the poaching gain. There is an inframarginal loss from giving more utility to high types because we're giving more utility to everybody that's not marginal, right? So that's the markup loss per sale. And the third term is the efficiency loss because the incentive constraint low types imitates high, it's binding. So if you want to give more indirect utility to high types, you're going to tighten this constraint. If you tighten this constraint, you have to over-provide quality even more. So that reduces efficiency and that reduces profits, of course. So in equilibrium, the indirect utility of high types weights these 3 facts, and it's easy to see that high types have to be worse off than incomplete information. Because if you rearrange this expression, you see that the high type indirect utility is given by the surplus, that's less than the efficient one, minus the brand loyalty parameter, plus some term that's negative. So this is, of course, bounded above by the complete information payoff. So the takeaway is that information rents are often negative under competition, at least for one of the types. This has been overlooked by the literature because in the monopoly outcome and along the 45-degree line, the inequality is weak. So the type that's loose, it's getting the same as under complete information. But in general, inequalities are strict whenever individual rationality constraints are not binding. So I'm running out of time. I just want to tell you 2 more things. One is that we can characterize when we have a pure strategy equilibrium, when we have a mixed strategy equilibrium. So this is region D plus. So in the bottom barrel case, I showed you that there's no pure strategy equilibrium in this interval. In fact, there is an area that's in the neighborhood of this interval where the no pure strategy equilibrium exists. In this region, all equilibria are in mixed strategy. The same applies to region D minus. Here's the area where the cream skimming duopoly doesn't exhibit a pure strategy equilibrium, and this applies to a neighborhood as described by this curve. So basically that completes the description. Okay, so that's the region of pure strategy, mixed strategy. That's the region of pure strategy. That's the efficiency region, and so on. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I want to give two highlights, and I invite people to see the paper for more details. The first one is that as the market gets more competitive, because brand loyalty decreases, it might well be that overall efficiency goes down. So more competitive markets are not associated with higher efficiency in general. And so this is well the case when, when more efficient markets, they have the incentive constraint more, so increasing the efficiency of the market tightens the incentive constraint. When that's the case, as you move towards a more efficient market, equilibrium welfare goes down. And that's described, that's always the case, because if you increase TH, for instance, qualities uniformly go down in equilibrium. So sometimes you may decrease TH, and if you're in region D+, you're going to have more over provision of quality, therefore equilibrium welfare goes down. In the paper, we also have comparative statistics on prices, and it's not what you expect as well. So the comparative statistics are very rich. So finally, I just want to say the following. The findings for the binary type model that I just described, they hold well beyond. In particular, they hold in a continuum of type setting with quadratic costs and a uniform distribution of types. So of course, the brand loyalty varies with types, just as in the binary type model that I described, and it's convenient to do so using an affine function. So when we do that, we can characterize equilibrium, it's an ODE and so on, and we find that you always have over provision of quality everywhere except at the bottom and the top when brand loyalty is decreasing with type, and you have under provision of quality all over the product line when brand loyalty is increasing with types. And we also find the same patterns of informational rents. Informational rents are negative at the bottom and positive at the top whenever brand loyalty is increasing with types, and informational rents are positive at the bottom and negative at the top whenever brand loyalty is decreasing with willingness to pay. Okay? And my last slide has to do with equilibrium existence. So in a sense, one of the results that I'm most fond of is the notion that pure strategy equilibria do not exist in our setup, precisely because of this interplay between self-selection constraints and heterogeneity in brand loyalty, right? The same applies to a continuum type setting, and the figures parallel. So this graph will have the low types brand loyalty here, the high types brand loyalty here. It's not the highest type and the lowest type, right? And then you get existence close to the diagonal, but you don't get existence when brand loyalty across types is sufficiently different. So this graph is very much the same that I described with the binary type model, where the region of non-existence lies close to the axis. Right? So I should stop here. So basically the takeaways are quality under provision and over provision reflects co-movements between taste for quality and brand loyalty. Informational rents may well be negative under competition. They are always negative for at least one type when IRs are slack. Competition and welfare often is aligned. More competitive markets may actually exhibit lower welfare. We have rich comparative statistics on prices, and I also emphasize that dispersion of offers here occurs because different types, they self-selection, and there's heterogeneity on brand loyalty. That differs from the reasons for price dispersion that we see elsewhere in the literature, like Varian or Burnt and Judd, that put forward the idea that there are informational frictions or such frictions. Here, the reason for non-existence is of a completely different nature. So I should stop here. I'm sorry for.
Okay, thank you very much, Renato. We don't have much time left for Q&As, but there's not too many that have been posted. I just have one quick question on the mixed strategy equilibrium. One you've already answered by looking at the continuum of types and showing that that doesn't give you global existence of a pure strategy equilibrium. But the other one is you're describing everything in terms of the utility levels that the agents get, and I think also the mixed strategy equilibria are described in that utility level. But at the end of the day, the firms will be choosing prices and qualities. Mm-hmm. So how do these mixed strategies over prices and qualities look like? That's what you will be observing as a
absolutely.
the data.
Yeah, no, it's easy to make this mapping, right? Because it all depends on I mean, in a continuum type setting, for instance, the quality is just a derivative of the indirect utility schedule, right? So for instance, in region D+, all equilibria exhibit over provision at the top, right? And so you obtain over provision at the top, you obtain the ordered structure of equilibria that gross utilities can move across types. We can characterize the qualities that prevail in equilibrium, and so menus that give more indirect utility are more efficient. So the characterization is in terms of indirect utilities, but it's straightforward to get back price and qualities.
So, but you're randomizing over 2 dimensions, right?
Yeah.
So there's different ways in which you can achieve the same indirect utility.
That's precisely the case. But it's the very first lemma that I described. So if you fix a profile of indirect utilities, there is always a profit maximizing way of generating that profile. Okay. So okay. That's how we do the map.
Okay, then becomes basically a one-dimensional problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
And because the equilibrium is ordered, everything is one-dimensional. In fact, you only need to randomize over one indirect utility, because there's going to be a function that's going to tell you, as a function of that indirect utility, how all others indirect utilities behave. So the fact that the equilibrium is ordered, that indirect utilities co-move, in fact, makes the problem completely one-dimensional.
Okay, very nice. Okay, thank you very much, Renato, for an entertaining and informative talk. And now we're looking forward to hearing from Laura Doval about another paper about nonlinear pricing, one with downstream markets. The floor is yours, Laura.
So I think I might need Renato to stop sharing the screen. Thank you. Perfect. So let me see if people can. Are the slides up? Perfect. So thank you so much for including the paper in the program. This is a different title, but it's the same paper. I just anticipated that Renato will take the nonlinear pricing game and change the title. That's me. No, I'm kidding. It's just that, as you will see, I think that even though there will be a nonlinear pricing in the paper, this is just like a title that fits better what the paper is doing in itself. So I'm going to start with a very obvious observation, which is that consumers and firms interact repeatedly. And I'm going to go for the obvious examples of online shopping on when you purchase a good followed by an add-on, but I'm sure you can come up with many other examples. And something that happens through these repeated interactions is that as consumers purchase from the firms, they reveal information either about their valuation or their willingness to pay. And this puts us in front of a familiar trade-off, which is that in as much as the consumer is revealing information, it means that she has to be getting better matches. But on the other hand, this puts us at the risk of the firm learning information that she can use to price discriminate. And I'm going to use price discrimination different than what Renato did, which is I'm going to say that the firm is price discriminating when she charges different prices for the exact same good with identical marginal cost. So this is the definition that shows up in Stigler and Varian, and you will see why it's important in this, why for me it's important to make this distinction in 1 or 2 slides. Now, anticipating, oh yes.
Laura, just a quick question. Can you go on full screen mode?
Oh, sure, sorry. Does that?
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
Perfect, sorry.
No problem.
Thank you. So anticipating that the firm will try to extract surplus once she learns the information, the consumer will demand that the firm leaves rents ex ante in order for her to be willing to reveal this information. And therefore, many models that try to establish the optimality of intertemporal price discrimination actually end up finding that it is not optimal when the firm has commitment. And this goes back to the work of Stokey, and in the case of evolving types over time, this goes back to the work of Baron and Besanko. And the idea is that the firm anticipates that she has to leave this rent in order to extract the information. If this is too costly, the firm might choose, because she has commitment, she can ignore the information, or she will choose not to use it. Now, of course, once we assume that the firm has limited commitment, we are going to obtain intertemporal price discrimination. And you can think of Hart and Tyrrell as an example of such a model, but this goes back to all the way to the literature on the ratchet effect. Now, one problem with the models that obtain intertemporal price discrimination under the assumption of limited commitment is that these models are a bit stark. And they're stark in two ways. On the one hand, these are models with one indivisible good with exact same marginal cost and for all consumers, which means that these are models that are very good to talk about price discrimination, but not about the benefit that the consumer gets from revealing information. And this is contrary to a model like in Moser-Rosen, where you can give different consumers different goods, and the way you do it is to reflect the consumer's preferences for quality. The other aspect in which these models are stark is that the firm has no way of escaping learning the information from the consumer. In the sense, there's this unique good, and the only thing that the firm can play with is the probability of trade and the transfers, but there's no way, for instance, to control how much she learns from the consumer by selecting what products she puts in the market. And you could think that in Moser-Rosen, for instance, the firm, by controlling the possibility of self-selection of the consumer, she can prevent she can obfuscate how much she learns from the consumer. So what we're going to do today is we're going to be looking at a very simple question, which is how does limited commitment, and therefore the inability to commit not to use information to price discriminate once this information has been learned, shapes the design of the product line. So we're going to be looking at a very simple model with two periods. In the first period, the firm will choose its quality range, its product line with non-decreasing marginal cost, and this will be like Moser-Rosen. And the first period of the model will allow us to talk about the benefits of using information. The more information the firm learns about the consumer, it means that she's tailoring better the product to the consumer's type. In the second period, the firm will have a unique indivisible good at zero marginal cost that she can put up for sale. And this will be the part of the model that will allow us to talk about the cost of using the information. So the more information the firm learns from the consumer in the first period, the more tempted she will be to price discriminate in the second period. And the consumer will have private valuation for each of her goods, and we're going to be in a dynamic mechanism design setting, in the sense that types will evolve over time, and the consumer in period one, even though she has information about how likely it is that she highly values the good in the indivisible good in the second period, she won't fully know this value. And what we are, but even though we're going to be in a setting with evolving private information, the model is chosen so that in the commitment solution, the firm doesn't want to price discriminate in the second period. So everything that we obtain in terms of price discrimination will be coming from the limited commitment. So what we are going to do is we're going to characterize the firm's optimal mechanism in this setting. And in particular, we're going to characterize the product line. And we're going to obtain that the firm will optimally choose to curtail the product line to prevent herself from price discriminating. So she's going to reduce the set of products that she puts in the market as a way of obfuscating how much she learns about consumers. And this is coming from limited commitment. So as Renato explained, in Moser-Rosen, what we obtain is that different types get a different quality provided than what would be the complete information outcome. But if you look at the set of products that the monopolist puts in Moser-Rosen, and you look at the set of products that the monopolist puts in the complete information outcome, they are exactly the same. So in a sense, Moser-Rosen in the second best and in the first best, in terms of the product line, they are observationally equivalent. But once you have a limited commitment, what will show up is that the product line will be, the range of products that the firm puts in the market will be distorted. And this idea that information can be used as a way to commit oneself, it's typical, it shows up in behavioral economics, and this is one way of thinking about what the firm is doing when she curtails her product line. Now, you can see also this application as a way to illustrate one of the extensions that we have in our work with Vasiliki on mechanism design with limited commitment. In that paper, we provide a revelation principle for to solve problems of mechanism design with limited commitment, and the first version of the paper focused solely on the case in which the agent had fully persistent private information. And here we will be illustrating an extension of those results to the case when the consumer's type evolves over time. So it's impossible to put in one slide the whole literature on product line design and price discrimination, but of course the paper is related to both. Johnson and Myatt are one of the first papers that provide this idea of product line pruning. Their rationale is that product line pruning may come from competition, whereas in our case it will come from this attempt of the firm to gain some commitment. And I might talk about the other papers down the line. So model is very simple. There's a firm and a consumer. They interact over 2 periods and 2 different transactions. In period 1, the firm will produce a good of variable quality. So Q1 will denote the quality, and it will be produced with quadratic marginal costs. Sorry, with quadratic costs, linear marginal costs. And X1 will denote the period 1 payment from the consumer to the firm. In the second period, the firm will produce an indivisible good at 0 marginal cost. So she either gives the good to the consumer or not. And X2 again will be the second period payment from the consumer to the firm. The consumer's valuation for the good, for each of the goods, is her private information. In period 1, if her type is theta and she gets quality Q1 and makes payments X1, this is going to be her utility. And theta is going to be distributed uniformly 0, 1. And in period 2, utilities will also be linear for the indivisible good. And we're going to assume that the value V can take one of 2 values, low or high. So I'm going to, in as much as possible, refer to V as the value of the consumer and theta as her type. So in period 1, we're going to be assuming that the consumer doesn't know her value for the good in period 2, but conditional on her type being theta, she knows the probability with which she will become a high value consumer, and that will be exactly theta. So what's the timing of the game? At the beginning of each period, the firm will offer the consumer a mechanism. The consumer observing the mechanism decides whether to accept or reject it. If she rejects that period, she doesn't get anything, but she also makes no payments. And we move into the next period if there's one more period remaining. If she accepts, then she will participate in the mechanism. This will determine the allocation. And once the allocation is determined, we'll move into the next period if there's a period remaining. So the thing that I need to specify now is what we mean by a mechanism. So mechanisms, as in our previous work, will be these tuples where we have a set of input messages M, a set of output messages S, and A stands in for the allocation. So it's the provision of quality and payments in the first period, or the provision of the indivisible good and the payment in the second period. And the mechanism has a communication device that takes each input message and maps it into a distribution over output messages and allocations. And the way these mechanisms work is that the consumer in each period, knowing her private information, she will send a message into the mechanism. So think of this as a report. The mechanism uses this to determine the distribution from which the output message and the allocation is drawn, and this outcome of the mechanism is what's publicly observable. So what the consumer does with the mechanism is not publicly observable, but what comes out of the mechanism will be publicly observable by both the firm and the consumer. So what we are interested in is in studying the best equilibrium outcome for the firm. And by equilibrium, we will mean perfect Bayesian equilibrium. And in particular, the focus here will be on the sequential rationality of the firm's strategy. So limited commitment will be capturing this idea that the mechanism that the firm will put forward in period 2 will be chosen only after she observes the quality provided in period 1. So maybe I should stop here in case there's questions before I start solving things.
So we didn't, oh, here's one Q&A. What happens if the consumer does not know the probability of becoming a high value type?
So so this will affect for sure how rents are left over time, and in particular, so I'm not sure about what I'm going to say next, but there's a chance that now the firm can fully extract in period 1 the surplus from the consumer. But what's tricky here is that because the firm has limited commitment, in period 2, she will not take into account that the surplus has been extracted. So, like in general, if this was the case with commitment, not having any information about the value in period 2 will lead to full surplus extraction in period 1 of that bit, and then doing the efficient thing in the second period. But I don't know in the case of limited commitment.
Okay, thanks. Well, I mean, my related question was, or what I didn't see for a long time was how the first period information is useful for the second period, but it comes from that correlation between type and value, right?
Yes, because basically the beliefs about theta determine how likely you are to charge different prices in the second period. No, but basically I think that question about the usefulness, I will address it in a second. The information about theta is useful in the first period to tailor the good to the consumer's type. So that's why theta is useful, you want to do the Musa-Rosen thing of giving each consumer a different quality, each consumer type a different quality. And for that, you need to learn theta. But if you learn theta, you will be in trouble in the second period, as you will see in a couple of slides.
Yeah. Another question that is from the Q&A. Do you have an application in mind?
So I guess what the most typical one would be, you purchase like some fancy good at the beginning, let's say a car, where you care about quality, and then you come back and have to purchase insurance for it. That would be like a Mickey Mouse example. But I think that some of the and online retailing would be another example. But I think that some of the forces that we're illustrating are more general than these examples.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's get to solving things. So finite horizon, we can work ourselves backwards through this game. So let's think of what the optimal mechanism is in period 2. In period 2, the world ends, so we might as well assume that the firm has commitment. And therefore, we know that the optimal mechanism to sell an indivisible good is going to be a posted price. The question is, how do we decide what price the firm will set? Well, it depends on how likely she thinks that she's facing a high-value consumer. But how likely she thinks she's facing a high-value consumer is tied to her beliefs about theta. So let me denote by F2 the potentially updated beliefs that the firm has about theta. And therefore, the posterior mean of theta is the firm's belief that she's facing a consumer with high valuation. And after that, determining the optimal mechanism is simple. If the firm believes that with low probability she's facing a high value consumer, she will set a price equals to the lowest valuation and serve both types. If that probability is sufficiently high that she's facing a high value consumer, she will choose a price equal to the BH, and there will be some threshold at which she's indifferent between selling the good at the low price and serving both consumers and selling the good at the high price. So this is what will allow us to talk about price discrimination. If different types theta lead to different beliefs, different posterior means about theta, then there's scope for the firm to charge different prices for the same good in the second period. And this threshold mu bar, it will show up later on, but I won't spend a lot of time explaining where it comes from. Probably you remember this from a second degree price discrimination. So now we have to go back to period 1. And now we cannot just say the firm has commitment, we can apply standard results to characterize the optimal mechanism. So here is where we need the results from our previous work. So what I want to do is show you how we are going to simplify what class of mechanisms we're going to look at and the consumer strategy in the mechanism. So it will be a consequence of our previous work that we can focus without loss of generality on mechanisms where the consumer will be asked to submit a type report, and where together with the allocation, the mechanism will output a belief. And it will be without loss of generality to focus on PB assessments where the consumer will participate in the mechanism. Conditional on participating, she will truthfully report her type to the mechanism, and there will be consistency between the beliefs that come out of the mechanism and the belief that the firm has about the consumer's type, conditional on observing that belief coming out of the mechanism. So the beliefs that come out of the mechanism, they are not only suggested beliefs, they will be the true beliefs that the firm will have at that point when she observes the outcome of the interaction in period 1. Now, in this setting where types are evolving over time, there are two kinds of beliefs that you might have thought would come out of the mechanism. One is beliefs about theta. The other ones are beliefs about V, the value. And it turns out that it comes out of our characterization that it is beliefs about theta, the ones that make the revelation principle work. And this is very similar to what happens in Jeff's paper on BIPs, the dynamic extension of Kamitz and Genskau's work to evolving types. Now, the next part of the result goes to Simon's question, which is that I started by showing these mechanisms that simultaneously draw conditional on a report, an allocation and output message. And it will be a consequence of our result that we can decompose these mechanisms in mechanisms that choose for each theta a distribution over posteriors, and for each posterior distribution over allocations. What this is saying is that the allocation that the firm chooses in period 1 has to be measurable with respect to the information that she learns about the consumer. So if she wants to implement the Musa-Rosen separating solution in period 1, she has to learn theta. There's no way of implementing that solution if you don't learn theta. So the whole tension here is that the more you tailor the allocation to the consumer's type, the more you're learning about theta, the more your prices will differ across consumer's type in the second period. So it's a quasi-linear environment, so it's without loss to think that the firm won't randomize in transfers. So even though I started with potential randomizing on allocations, we won't need the randomization of transfers. And for what I'm going to do, it will be without loss of generality also to assume that the firm won't randomize in the quality provision. And I'm going to denote by Q2 of BL and F2 the probability that when the belief in the second period is F2, the firm serves both types of consumer. And it will be important to keep track of this object because this is what determines the rents in the second period. So let me set up the problem of the firm, and then I'm going to start using pictures. So let's think of the firm's payoff. If she generates a posterior of F2, she will get some expected payment from the consumer. She will produce some quality at a certain cost. And in the second period, if at that posterior she's willing to serve both types of the consumer, she gets with probability 1 a price equals to VL. If she only wants at that posterior to serve the high type consumer, she gets a payment of VH, but only with the probability that theta has value VH, which is the P of theta. Condition on theta, these posteriors have probabilities given by the mechanism, and now I need to integrate overall types. So this is basically the expected utility of the firm from the perspective of the first period. And what our theorem says is that if I want to characterize the firm optimal mechanism, what I need is to maximize this expression with respect to the beta and the quality provision and the expected transfer, subject to the typical participation and truth-telling constraints, and a constraint that will link the beliefs that come from the mechanism with Bayesian updating. So let's think about, to think about participation, let's think about the consumer's payoff. If the posterior is F2, this is quality, this is a payment, this is the consumer's flow payoff. Tomorrow, with that posterior, the consumer gets utility, positive utility, only when her valuation is high and the firm sets a low price, because in that case, she gets rents. In all other cases, either she has a high valuation and the price is high, or she has a low valuation, in which case she either doesn't buy, or when she buys, her whole surplus is extracted, then she gets zero. So we need to integrate overall the posteriors. This is a consumer's utility. We're just going to ask that this is non-negative for all the types. We are also going to ask that the consumer wants to report her type truthfully. By lying, what she does is she alters the distribution of her posteriors that she faces. And finally, we'll have a condition that basically says that if I tell the firm that her belief is F2, F2 is the belief at which she updates. Now, here's where I'm going to start being a little bit less formal. From here, you can see very clearly how we are going to obtain an envelope representation of the payoffs from the incentive compatibility constraints. We're also going to obtain, like in the literature information design, from the beta and the prior, we can turn it into distribution over posteriors. So you can think of the beta as the experiment in Kamenitz and Genskal, and I can turn that into distribution over posteriors that averages out to the prior. Because we have a single crossing condition in the payoffs, and this will allow me to express everything about the firm only in terms of the provision of quality in period 1 and the distribution over posteriors. Because I have the single crossing condition on the payoffs, I will also obtain a monotonicity constraint, but I'm going to ignore it. And then I'm going to come back at the end and show you when the optimal mechanism that I characterize as a solution when we ignore the monotonicity constraint can actually be implemented. So basically what we have is we can ignore the transfers and focus just on the distribution over posteriors and the quality provision. And we will have a maximization of a virtual surplus that will consist of 2 parts. One is a virtual surplus in period 1, which depends on the beliefs generated, but also on the quality provision. And if I showed you the formula, it looks like Musa Rosen, but written in the language of posteriors. So it's a more complicated version of like the textbook object. And then we'll have a second period virtual surplus, which is taking into account that the firm today has to leave rents to the consumer as a function of how informative her type is about the value tomorrow. Now, because I'm ignoring monotonicity, I can take this expression and maximize it point-wise for each posterior in the quality. And once I do that, I will have an expression that only depends on the distribution over posteriors. Now, so far I haven't used any of the parametric assumptions that I made at the beginning. Why are they there? Well, because under these parametric assumptions, this whole objective function is only a function of the posterior mean. And I need to do this because if you're familiar with the literature and information design, most of the tools or all the tools for the case of the continuum focus on the case of the posterior mean. So this will allow me to use the results there to talk about the optimal mechanism for the firm. So let me start by illustrating the intuition behind the commitment solution, or why under commitment you don't want information disclosure. And I'm going to do this by making you look at a fictitious problem where we're going to choose a distribution over posteriors to maximize this first object. And I'm going to choose a different distribution over posteriors to maximize the second object. Of course, I cannot, in general, this problem is not feasible because it has to be the same distribution over posteriors, but by looking at this fictitious problem, we'll get some intuition for what happens in the commitment solution. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot the two integrands, and I'm going to use the shape of those integrands to give you intuition. So the left-hand side is a convex function. This is the virtual surplus as a function of the posterior mean in Moser-Rosen. And it's convex, or at least, and strictly so, above a half, because in the linear quadratic model, you want to match each type to a different quality above a half, and you want to exclude everyone below. And if you're familiar with the results in Dvorak and Martini, this says that to maximize the payoff, you want to choose an information policy that fully discloses the types above a half. On the other hand, on the left-hand side, I have the virtual surplus in the second period, which is from the sale of the durable good. And what's happening here is that this is linear in the posterior mean, because basically the virtual surplus is an expectation using theta. And below mu bar, remember, the price is VL, and above mu bar, the price is VH. And the parameters are such that in this case, the seller in period one, from the perspective of period one, he would want a price of VL and not a price of VH. Now, you can use the results in Ariely, Babichenko, Smorodinsky, and Yamashita to show in this case that no disclosure is optimal for the second period virtual surplus. And the way to do this is to take the concave closure of this function and check at the prior mean, which in the uniform case is a half, that the original function coincides with the concave closure. So what this is saying is that from the point of view of the commitment solution, from the point of view of solving each problem separately, you want to learn state in period one, but you want to ignore this in period two. And under commitment, the solution is feasible. I use information to provide quality, and then in the second period, I fully ignore it. But under limited commitment, this solution won't be possible, because if I want to do what maximizes the left-hand side, I need to learn everyone's theta above a half, which means that in the second period, I will generate price discrimination, at least for the consumers above a half. On the other hand, if I want to keep myself in the dark in period two and generate the prior mean, that means that in the first period, I can only produce this, which in the uniform case is tantamount to excluding everyone. So I will now walk you in pictures through the solution to the problem, but it will be a balance between the benefits of tailoring the product to the consumer's type in period one, and this force that in the commitment solution, you would like not to price discriminate, and you're going to try to do this as much as possible. But just briefly, just to sum up, the commitment solution basically goes as follows. If the threshold at which you switch from low price to high price in the second period is below the prior mean, so at the prior mean you want to set a price of VH, then you're always going to set a price of VH, but then you're going to do the Moser-Rosen quality provision in period one. And if you're above, if at the prior mean you want to charge a price of VL, exactly you will charge a price of BL in period 2 to all consumer types, but you're going to provide quality as in Musa-Rosen in the linear quadratic case. So I'm going to illustrate the solution by just plotting types against the quality they obtain in period 1. In the first best, in the linear quadratic model, basically, and once I normalize the marginal cost to 1, this is a 45-degree line. So each type gets matched to quality equals to their type. In the second best, in the Musa-Rosen solution, we get exclusion below a half, and then we get this downward distortion. But if you look at the product range, the set of qualities that are put in the market, they are the same in the first best and the second best. And this is more general than the uniform example. Now, let's start thinking about how limited commitment affects this solution. And I'm going to do so by considering higher and higher values of that threshold mu bar. So I'm going to put here always the second period price under commitment. So let's start with the case in which this threshold is below a quarter. In this case, the commitment solution is feasible, but what we're going to do is change the way information is disclosed. So what the firm is going to do is she's going to give all the types above a half their Musa-Rosen quality, but then she's going to pull everyone that got quality 0 into one message. And the reason is that the expectation of theta, condition of theta being below a half, which is condition of theta being excluded, is a quarter. And when a quarter is bigger than mu bar, then the firm in the second period wants to price these low types to VH. So even though the commitment solution is feasible, the way information is transmitted across periods changes, because in the commitment solution, we can elicit theta and then ignore it. Now, once we raise mu bar above a half, this stops being, above a quarter, this stops being feasible. So what the firm will do is she's going to start pulling more and more consumers above a half so that she meets mu bar. So that when she tells her future self, people below M star are excluded, then she's willing to price them at VH. So in this case, what the firm will do is she's going to exclude people below M star. She's going to do the Musa-Rosen thing above M star. And we're going to obtain the first case of product line pruning, but without price discrimination. So in this case, the firm always prices at VH in the second period, just as in the commitment solution, but she's going to shrink the number of products in the market. Now, this is one case where we can clearly see what's going to happen in terms of welfare. The firm is clearly worse off because she's not getting the commitment payoff. The consumers are also worse off, and every consumer type is worse off. So we have types here that are now excluded, that they were not excluded in period 1, in the commitment solution. But because they are excluded, the product line has shrunk, which means that all the consumers that actually get quality, they have less substitutes, and having less substitutes means that the firm can crank up the prices on these products. So the consumers face higher prices in the commitment solution, so they are worse off. The firm doesn't get the commitment payoff, she's worse off. So this is one of the cases where you can get a clear comparative static from the fact that the cake has shrunk, but this affects everyone in the same way. So far I haven't said anything about price discrimination, so let's go to the case where mu bar is greater than a half. So in the commitment solution, you would like to have a low price in the second period. So what's going to happen now is that the firm will have to sacrifice quality provision to generate low prices. So what she's going to do is at the beginning, she's going to pull types so as to convince her future self that they are worth pricing low. And she's going to provide them with an average quality. So what we see here as compared to the commitment solution is that types between lower than a half are going to be getting more quality than in the second best. And these guys are going to get less quality than in the second best. So we see over and under provision of quality. We're going to see that the product line shrinks. But now we're going to get price discrimination at the high end of the product line. So this is related to something Renato said, which is that at the bottom of the product line, that's where like most of the profits are concentrating. There you're going to tailor the product to the consumer's type. So there you won't sacrifice the tailoring, but this has to come at the cost of price discrimination in the second period. And finally, as this threshold at which you switch from low to high becomes higher, what's going to happen is that you're going to start separating the low types, you're going to separate the high types, and you're going to take this pooling interval more and more to the middle. So you're going to continue taking products out of the market, but this is going to this is not going to be by inviting very low type consumers into quality provision in the first period. But again, we're always going to obtain the price discrimination at the high end of the market. So let me briefly talk about implementation before my time runs out. So far what I've shown you is the solution to the relaxed problem. So conditional on the relaxed problem satisfying the monotonicity constraint, one thing that I haven't highlighted is that in this model, this distribution over posteriors over posterior means can actually be implemented with the consumer making choices out of the menu. And the firm observing these choices and learning exact same information as I showed in the pictures. So what this highlights is that using our framework, you can sometimes turn the problem of determining the strategy of the consumer in the first period into an information design problem, and then using the distribution over posteriors to back out the consumer strategy. Of course, this doesn't happen always in our setting, but when it does, it gives you tractability over, for instance, like more complicated problems where you have to be thinking about this complicated, like if you look at this picture, we have separation, pooling and separation. We didn't have to think about the consumer. And if we had written things in terms of the consumer strategy, things would have been more difficult. Now, the question is, when is the commitment solution implementable, the limited commitment solution implementable? So when does monotonicity is satisfied? This gray area, so I'm plotting this as a function of the marginal cost and the threshold. This gray area is the set of parameters for which it is not satisfied. And everywhere else, the solution can be implemented. And what's happening here is exactly like the Lafont and Tirole take the money and run strategy, because here is where we start getting price discrimination. But that means that the very high types have to be compensated in period 1 for the fact that they're going to get their surplus extracted in period 2. So they're getting very high payments. And now the lower types, they might want to claim that they are high types to cash in these payments. So this is, it's basically the same logic as in the Lafont and Tirole 1988 paper for why monotonicity cannot hold. There are no parameters for which monotonicity holds there. And with that, I'm going to thank you, and maybe if there's more questions, I can take them.
Thank you very much, Laura, for an inspiring talk. There's 2 questions by Paul Heidhuis.
Yes.
Only if there's time, so I think we're going to take the time. The first question is, you are characterizing a perfect Bayesian equilibrium, if I understand correctly. Anything known about the set of equilibria? Is this the most reasonable equilibrium for predicting market outcomes?
So first I need some solution concept that accommodates sequential rationality, and the fact that we have a continuum of types and a firm that has a very rich action space puts us in the world of perfect Bayesian equilibrium. One thing that I was not that I was not very precise when I presented is the kinds of conditions we're putting on base rule when possible and actually the ones that we're putting would make our solution concept the same as the feed-embedded role. So basically we're putting signaling when you don't know. So the firm can, if the firm deviates, she cannot update her beliefs about the consumer. So it's a very, in a sense, well-behaved version of perfect Bayesian equilibrium. But of course, like if you attended John Baker's lecture yesterday, our consumers and our firms, everyone is very, very rational.
Okay, it's a very nice role. I mean, I can just translate the questions, and I'm not responsible for them. But that seemed like a good answer to me. The second question Paul had was: can the firm suggest a crazy out of equilibrium mechanism for which there is no best response for the consumer in the second period? So how is PB defined in after such histories?
So I know that can happen for sure when you have multiple agents. Yes, so here we're not dealing with this because in the second period, the problem is very well defined. It's a posted price regardless of what the firm belief is. And therefore the consumer's problem is well defined. And if the question relates to like the application of the revelation principle, well, that's in a sense like the cheat of the revelation principle, where you start from an equilibrium, and then you replicate outcomes. But this issue maybe because we're looking into a single agent setting, this issue hasn't arisen in any of the examples that we have solved. But that's a good question.
Okay, as you know, response by Paul, I take it that you satisfactorily answered his questions. Well, on behalf of EARIE and the audience, I thank you both for great presentations that very neatly, great papers that very neatly complement each other. All right, with that, I conclude the session. I hope to see you all soon in Rio somewhere.
And thank you for organizing this. It was a great conference.
Thank you.
Thanks for the organizer as well. It's been great. Thank you.
Yes.